We're tapping about 1,000 service members, mostly from the Army and from the Navy, to build Biden's pier off the coast of Gaza for humanitarian aid, they say. It's just one example. New military estimates say the predicted cost has already doubled to about $320 million. But despite our massive debt and deficit, I think this is the least of our immediate concerns, because the area itself is within range of Hamas rockets and has already come under attack by mortar shells. And after getting 3 young service members killed in their sleeping quarters in Jordan just the other month, plus 2 Navy SEALs, and having dozens of troops in the region suffer from traumatic brain injuries and the like from having to deal with Iran and its proxies, just what are we going to accomplish with this pier, aside from getting more of our young people killed in a foreign conflict by helping both sides? Well, according to Jamal Bowman, we're going to get a bunch of new refugees from Gaza and from this pier, but I don't see that as an accomplishment. Joining us now to discuss is John Byrnes, a senior advisor for Concerned Veterans for America. John, thanks for being back tonight.
Thanks for having me on as always, and congratulations, by the way.
Oh, thank you so much. So there was a House Armed Services Committee hearing today in which the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, admitted to Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz that it's entirely possible that our troops will come under fire while building this pier. What does their exchange tell you?
Well, it doesn't really tell me anything I didn't know, but for the civilian viewer, for the person who hasn't served, this is just one of the multiple complications that occur in an operation like this that contingency planners, the leaders, the generals, the admirals have to think about. And it's clear from listening to that exchange and from the news over the past few weeks, actually since President Biden proposed this, that this is just all kinds of a bad idea. And I say that as somebody who's been a combat engineer, somebody who's done humanitarian relief missions overseas with the Marine Corps. There's just so many things that can go wrong with this project.
You know, and also another point that Congressman Gaetz pointed out to the defense secretary, he said that, you know, Biden's promised us over and over when it comes to these foreign conflicts, including this one, Israel and its fight against Hamas terrorists, that there will be no American boots on the ground. But he says if we're putting boots on the ground to build the pier, I know it's not exactly combat related, but the defense secretary is also saying they have the right to defend themselves if they're fired upon, so they may have to then fight back. So does that mean that this kind of is boots on the ground? You know, Secretary Austin says no, it's not, but Congressman Gaetz said it's just kind of a difference without a real distinction. So do you think that this constitutes, in some ways at least, boots on the ground?
You know, I think it's as close as you can get. I think, you know, they're playing cute with the words boots on the ground. This is essentially boots on the ground. They're a few hundred meters, a mile offshore. They are certainly within range of many of the weapons that Hamas has. The problem is that, you know, not only do those young men and women who are American servicemen who are putting this, you know, pier together before it's put ashore by the Israelis, they're carrying weapons. But what he really means is that there are weapons on the warships offshore. If Hamas attacks American soldiers, the self-defense proposition is going to come down to, do we shoot back or do we let it happen? And if they shoot back, I'm reasonably sure from everything that I've seen over the past 6 months and certainly all of my military career, that Hamas is not going to shoot from a hilltop. They're going to shoot from the rooftop of a hospital or a school or something else. And the Americans are going to be faced with either taking the fire or committing an atrocity that Hamas can turn on us.
And I think that's also a very important point to bring up with this. And going back to what you're saying, you know, you have, if I heard you correctly, you have experience as a combat engineer, so going abroad and building and making things right. So we have this pier being built and now it's already doubled in cost. But, you know, is this just part of, like you said, a lot of the issues that already are somewhat inherent in this project?
The issues are just, there's just so many of them. I mean, we're building this pier in cooperation with the Israelis who are at war with Hamas. It's supposed to push humanitarian aid through. Among the other missions I've done overseas are humanitarian aid missions. And it's just so hard when one side decides to use food and suffering as a weapon. It's so hard to push through that humanitarian aid without overwhelming military force. And that's going to play right into Hamas's hands if the Israelis have to use overwhelming military force to push humanitarian aid through. And we're certainly not in a position to provide that overwhelming force. You know, President Biden is trying to thread the needle here between people who want to support Israel and people who want to support Hamas and his party. I think he's really stretched himself thin on this one. And again, this is just something that no American should be at any kind of risk for this particular mission. We're not going to accomplish very much. It's probably just a photo op to say we have a pier there. I'd be very, very, very skeptical that any sizable percentage of this aid actually reaches starving Gazans. I think it's more likely that most of it becomes, a reserve supply for the Hamas fighters themselves.
And that's the fear that so many have, is that, like you said, Biden trying to placate two very different sides of his own political party right before this major presidential election year means that he's ending up funding both sides in some ways. Obviously funding Israel more than Hamas and Gaza in the Gazan residents, but that kind of help, Hamas, it doesn't take much for them to pull off atrocities. And so we end up kind of shooting ourselves in the foot in that way. And you and I have already talked about just the broader conflict, right? Because Iran has its fingerprints all over Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and all the rest. And I mentioned earlier the 3 National Guardsmen who've been killed already, 2 Navy SEALs who've been killed, dozens in the area as well who are basically sitting ducks, and they've had to deal with all sorts of attacks. It's left many with traumatic brain injuries and the like. But, they say we're there for deterrence, that we're in Iraq and Syria and these other neighboring nations, but has it really had that deterring effect that the administration claims it has?
I don't think so. This is an area, just like other parts of the world, where the locals are always going to be more interested in what happens than we are. Obviously, it's a place where we've spent a lot of blood and treasure, and the viewpoint I have, the viewpoint the Concerned Veterans for America has, is that we just shouldn't spend any more blood and any more treasure on peripheral wars unless there's some national interest or vital gain for the U.S. economy, vital gain for the American people. And that's just not the case in this war between the Israelis and the Gazans. It's terrible that the Gazan people, that the Palestinian people in Gaza are suffering. But again, the percentage of that aid that will actually make a difference is so small that the risk to our soldiers is so high. And if folks, if they want to learn more about these policies, or click a button and tell their representatives and senators that this is a bad idea, they can go on the CV4A.org website and just hit the take action button, and it'll be easy from there.
No, and I really appreciate you guys for, bringing this to light as well, especially from a veteran's perspective. I think that's what we need to hear. And before I let you go tonight, I saw also on your social media, you're talking about a new report, I believe it came out, Empower Oversight Report. And it was just talking about our veterans just in general, right, who are already in America. They did their time, they worked hard, fought hard, did whatever was asked of them by this nation, and then they don't really get treated too well afterwards. Again, that's another conversation you and I have had. But can you just briefly, before we go into this break here, talk about how our veterans are being treated and how this new report talks about that many of them want to seek health care and other help outside the VA system because it's just not working for them?
All I know is that this whistleblower broke some pretty pretty bad news for the VA, but at the same time, it's nothing that you and I and folks who follow the VA and know how bad the bureaucracy is there. But this is the first we've heard about it. This information didn't go to the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. It didn't go to the House Veterans Affairs Committee. It was an internal report that the VA didn't want to share with anyone. And it's all about, once again, how the taxpayer dollars that you and I and our fellow Americans pay in order to make veterans' lives healthier and more prosperous just aren't going to the veterans.
No, you're exactly right, John. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight.